One of Ramesh's favorite quotes that he would weave into the satsangs is a quote from Buddha, which he liked because it points out that this notion of non-doership is key, and it also points out that this is not something that he or I just made up, but it's something that has existed in teachings for a very long time. In fact, if you go looking for it, there are references to non-doership in many different teachings. And so he would point out that Buddha was known to say that events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. And so if we look, events, the important words here are events, deeds and consequences. The word happen, and no individual doer that makes those things happen. So I'll repeat the quote. Events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. And why the word happen is important in the statement is that it refers, first, events, deeds, and consequences are all movements of life. You could have a thunderstorm, that is an event. You have a deed, so someone, is carrying some heavy bags, and you offer to help them with the bags. That's a deed. And then a consequence to that, they might give you some money in appreciation. You might trip over and break your ankle. They might think you're trying to steal their bags and hit you off. So consequence to a deed. Really, it's talking about the flow of life. So it's saying the flow of life happens, but breaking it down into events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. It is all a happening according to God's will, or a happening to all a happening because that is life. That is what happens in life as a life as a singularity, life as a interconnected singularity, rather than how we tend to interpret life as a whole lot of individual separate parts. And when we interpret it as a whole lot of individual separate parts, we tend to then introduce, by default, there has to be this controller that is making all of the individual bits move. And so that's where the notion of a doer, meaning an idea that there is something independent of the mechanics that has complete control and volition, complete autonomy over what happens next. And that's our idea of who we are, the one that controls, the one that is volitional and autonomous. When we investigate this further, we find that there is no such entity. What there is a biological and psychological entity that functions, and that functioning is far more mechanical, or independent of someone controlling, but rather it moves in response to things. So if the hot plate is touched, there is a sensation of heat and pain, and the body is programmed to do something in regard to that sensation. It moves away, and we only become aware of the moving away. So touching a hot plate is a good example, because it might become evident that the moving away is very automatic. When it comes to something like pumping of the heart or filtering of the liver, it becomes even more obvious that it's automatic, because you don't ever think that you don't ever consciously feel like you are controlling those movements. So we can understand in principle how things happen automatically, mechanically. Now the job is to extend that automatic movement of things that we can comprehend in relation to some functions, like the heart beating or the liver cleansing the system, extend it into those functions that we believe are my doing, like the speaking, for example, or thinking. It feels like that is something that I do. And so then there is a claiming of control over how it should have happened, and that I should have done it a particular way. So if your heart skips a beat, it might be scary, but you don't sort of blame yourself for skipping a beat, like, oh, I didn't do very well because I skipped a beat. So you might be worried about it, but we don't claim responsibility over controlling that function. Whereas, if something is said in a conversation that might have hurt the other, then we respond to that as if we were in control. Now, this isn't to say that if something was said that to hurt the other, that we don't try and make the situation better, because it's not our intention to hurt the other, or hopefully it's not our intention to hurt the other. So if there's something you can do, like an apology, then by all means. And even when I'm speaking about this, it sounds like, oh, well, now you will be doing the apology. And what is really happening is that something was said, it becomes evident that the other is hurt, and the automatic movement will be a movement of trying to fix that, to, let's say, make the pain less. And so we can apologize. There can be an apologizing that happens. And the reason that I'm bringing up the topic and saying, look, there's no reason that apologies can't happen, is that sometimes the notion of non-doership can kick in such that it will interfere with an apology happening. So the understanding, oh, I'm not the doer, can become a concept that becomes part of the system. That means the system then won't apologize. And that's not ideal. So if the understanding of non-doership starts to happen, and the system starts interfering with certain functions that were there before, that's often a very good thing, because what it's interfering with is the notion of guilt and shame. And sometimes in that process, we might find ourselves not understanding that apologizing makes sense. In fact, we might see an apology as a sign that we think we are the doers. And so the very act of apologizing might stop happening for a while, until it starts to become clear that there are maybe different layers to life. The biological layer, that is the movement that happens according to circumstance, and the psychological layer. And the psychological layer is the attitude to the circumstance. And so an apology doesn't necessarily mean that there is guilt and shame. An apology means there is an appreciation that something that happened through this body-mind organism delivered pain to someone, and let's say it wasn't our intention to do so. And so in the same way, if an intellectual block doesn't exist, an apology would be forthcoming. And that's part of the flow of life. Attitudinally, we don't have to feel guilt about what has happened, because we understand that, well, it happened because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. It wasn't ideal. We can see that relative to certain outcomes. We could say, well, the fact that it happened, even though it wasn't my doing, it still has a consequence. And so we can see the consequences, not pleasure, let's say. And so if there is something we can do to rectify the situation or make it a bit better, acceptance of what is, acceptance of what happened, and seeing it as part of life and not my doing, shouldn't get in the way of us trying to fix it. The problem comes in where not only do we see that the consequence of our actions was, let's say, pain to the other, but then we feel guilt about it. And guilt means this uncomfortableness with oneself. So I'll talk more about this non-doership, which, as many of you know, is the basis of the teaching, and why it's so important. You probably already have a feel that if we have this attitude of non-doership, then essentially it becomes the basis where guilt and shame, a sense that I'm not good enough the way I am if things don't turn out perfectly, will arise, and an attitude of blame and hatred towards the other for things they might do that have hurt us. And there's a couple of examples that came to mind this week about things that happened, in my past, that would be very easy to ruminate over, and yet I find I don't. But the process of not ruminating over it is usually a process of us seeing those attitudes of guilt and blame arise when the habit is still in place. And for us to see, actually, this is very usual, because, as I've said many times, the way that the humans develop is in such a way that this belief of doership kicks in. But it is doership. So once we start to understand and we see it happening in our own interactions, if we also at first intellectually understand that it really doesn't deliver anything positive in our life to make an enemy essentially of another person, then there can be a motivation that gets set up inside of us for that type of thinking to get interfered with. And until we realize that this attitude of doership that creates this self-loathing and blame and hatred towards others, until we know it exists, until we know it's a thing, we essentially don't look at the output of that attitude. It just happens. So the guilt and the blame happens, and we haven't really been alerted to it as something important to look at. And so it just happens, and we assume it's how people live life, because it's how we live life, it's how we comment on life, and it doesn't get interfered with. So before I go on, last week I mentioned that I was considering holding some online intensives, and that more details would be available shortly. So the details will be available mid next week, probably around Wednesday, and they'll be on the website. But I do have some details in my head that I'll share with you now, because there were quite a few people that emailed and messaged last week. I didn't reply to those emails and messages because I was still trying to figure out what was best to offer. I did reply to one or two, and the details might be different, so you can ignore what I said in the emails. And maybe I'll get the details right now. So my intention is to offer A 6-day intensive once a month. And each intensive will focus on a particular part of the spiritual journey. And I think this is going to be particularly useful because it means that one particular topic or subset of the journey can be explored in detail day after day after day for 6 days. One session a day, it'll be a 2-hour session, and it will include satsang on the topic and question and answers, which allow obviously people to ask questions and for me to further elaborate on the topic through the answers. There will be 2 versions of the one intensive run on the same week to cater for the time difference, because I'm in Australia and different people obviously in different parts of the world will be sleeping when it's daytime for me. And there is a time at 2 ends of the day, in the morning and in the evening, that allows people in the US to tune in at a reasonable time, and for people in Europe and India to tune in at a reasonable time. So essentially, the intensives will start on a Monday, Australia time, and finish on a Saturday, Australia time. The first sessions will be at 7 a.m. Or 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Australia time, which is US time, Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. the day before, and it runs through to 9 p.m. the day before. So if it starts on a Monday in Australia, which it does, Monday morning at 7 a.m., would make that Sunday night in the US at 7 p.m. And then in Australia time, it would run through Monday morning, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, Thursday morning, Friday morning, and finish on Saturday morning, which is actually Friday evening US time. And the second version is for those people in India and Europe and Australia. Well, the Australians could choose any time they liked or any session they liked, and that would be at 4:30 p.m. Australian time to 6:30 p.m. Australian time, and that equates to something like 10:30 in the morning if you're in Europe, or maybe 9:30 in the morning, or 11, depending on which country you're in. So the first few topics of the intensives that I've got in mind, the first one is going to be the framework that really elaborates and goes into all of the very specific terminology and the concepts that tie into each other, all of it bringing it back to peace of mind and daily living. The second intensive, which will be in the following month, will be about witnessing and abiding in I Am, which will focus on some meditation and also looking at life, not particularly from a daily living point of view, but how is it that we can awaken to awareness and rest in being. The next topic, the month after, will be about the end of shoulds and shouldn'ts, and how we bring the framework and abiding in I Am into how we move through the day, doing in each moment exactly what we feel like, which means essentially challenging the ways that we have assumed life should be lived, challenging the concepts that have been given to us by our parents and society and our friends, and really saying, what is it that I want to be doing? How is it that I want to make decisions? And often we'll find that we've been making decisions because of what we think we have to do. And when we look at it, we'll find we've been making decisions because we've been valuing certain outcomes, and our whole strategy of life is to get outcomes, which is where we think happiness will be found. But once we realize happiness is not to be found in other people loving you or in gaining material wealth, then if we see that our whole motive operandi in life, our whole strategy is to maximize these outputs, and that we have maybe allowed that to cover up a flow or being in tune with the body and doing what we really feel like. That way of functioning, if we continued to live life according to the shoulds and shouldn'ts, really keeps us off a flow where we feel connected to source, where we feel like we really are being lived. And so that's a very important topic. The month after, it's going to be on energetic release and emotional release, some techniques that are useful there, and encouraging a feeling of the old feelings of guilt and blame and shame and worry and anxiety, which is something that tends to be warned against or suggested against when we are focusing on the witnessing and the resting in being. And that has its place, and it's a very important part of the process. But if we only ever hear that that is what is important, to just witness and not be involved and not worry about concepts, and to allow everything to arise and subside, and we use that exclusively, thinking that we just need to dive deeper and deeper into that, what we'll find is that we may think it's actually disadvantageous to feel and to allow these emotions to come up, and for us to relive, let's say, feelings of hatred and guilt, which ordinarily we might cut off and say, this is too painful, or this is unenlightened for me to feel these feelings. And there's a very important part of the process, which is a time when certain blocks and certain defenses of the system have opened up sufficiently that these energies are moving, and if we don't allow them to sort of surface, because we are continually stepping back and allowing them to be in the space of awareness where they tend to dissolve, we might think that dissolving, where they dissolve in the space of awareness, is them sort of leaving the system, whereas I'd suggest that there's another process by which they leave the system. And so the witnessing and then the feeling of the feelings are two equally important movements. And I think that a seeker needs to appreciate both of them. So that is very much the topic of an intensive, just like abiding in I am and witnessing is a topic of an earlier intensive. And finally, one that I like the most, but it won't necessarily be appropriate for everyone, just like you have to pick which intensive is suitable for you, is post-awakening. Once someone has become very familiar with the beingness and the witnessing, there are often a whole lot of concepts that have aided in a movement towards knowing oneself as formless awareness, or feeling like life is a dream, that you are not the doer. Many spiritual concepts. Another one is that there is no awareness in deep sleep. These notions, these spiritual concepts are, as Ramana has described them, thorns that can be used to uproot a thorn in the thumb. And very often, because they are repeated as if they are truth at particular points of the journey, in order for them to do their work, they do get embedded themselves and take the place of the previous thorn. And so then you'll have a person going around saying there is no person, because there have been certain insights that show the variability of what we know ourselves as. So we might see how thought can dissolve, and then when thought dissolves, the experience in the moment is very different to the embodied sense of a person that can be there at other times. And so when we see that essentially the feeling of a person is a construct of a whole lot of different aspects, a whole lot of different objects in awareness, it can become apparent that there is no person as we assumed a person to exist, essentially a concrete, unchanging, this is who I am. And as we look at it in more detail, we see there's nothing to grab onto, that in a meditation, the body sensation is not there, and certain thoughts are not there. And as we see the different layers of the person, we can have an insight, there is no person. And that's very, very important. However, the integration process needs us to then acknowledge, but there is the appearance of a person, and that is what has to live the rest of this life. And we can go around essentially disembodied for a whole lifetime if certain integrating concepts don't come about, aren't introduced into the system. So for those people, and there's less of, ironically, there's less of the audience of these talks that particular intensive would be suitable for, because as a result of, through the talks, I tend to introduce a counterbalance to the concepts, whereas some other teachings will take a more absolutist approach, and then a sort of more particular undoing of some of the remnants of those concepts needs to happen later. So ideally there would be people who have had awakenings through other teachings that are more specifically focused on the esoteric side of non-duality, that would probably participate in the sort of questioning certain spiritual beliefs, certain spiritual concepts that may well have become an obstacle in themselves. And once our own intellect sees that, oh, this idea that I've been holding, I am not the body, for example, may not be as absolutely true as it has been held. That's not to say that it shouldn't have been held as absolutely true, because that did something. But maybe at a certain time we need to realize, oh, what I am is a body and consciousness that is functioning through the body, like a package deal. And because I didn't see, we weren't aware of the consciousness, it was always there, but there was no awareness of the consciousness. So we lived life as if we were just the body, because that was the aspect of the person, of the human being, that was evident. And so if we come to see, oh, those teachings said you are not the body, because it's the best way to get us to essentially disidentify with the part of the human being that we were overly identified with, and identify or recognize the part of the human that was being missed, that wasn't being appreciated. And now we might find that we've flung to the other side, where we say, I am only awareness, I am not the body. And that is essentially the same problem, but on a different part of the spectrum. And so it needs to be integrated. And something like what I've just described, if that's put forward and someone thinks about it and catches their own critical thinking error, then another shift is bound to happen. And so that integrating part is something I'm pretty keen on talking about. So that will be an intensive on of its own. And as the year goes on, then I'll pick new topics for the intensives. There's a charge for the intensives. which helps me maintain my living expenses. I've tried to keep it to something reasonable. It'll be $190 for the session, US dollars, which is about 155 or 160 euros. And in Australian dollars, which is really what I'm working off, it's 240 Australian dollars. So I hope some of you will feel like it's something you'd like to do, to dive deeper into those specific areas. And I think that the fact that they are 6 sessions back to back can deliver something that the satsangs don't always often. Anyway, this is not meant to be just an advertising session, although I hope that in describing those different sections, my intention wasn't to just advertise, but really to elaborate on little parts of the teaching as I was giving the description. So now going back to on the first one, we'll start on the 26th of July, I think it is, Monday the 26th of July, finishing on Saturday the 31st of July. That's Australian time, Australian dates. So in the US it would be the day before, and in Europe it would be the same, 26th to the 31st. More details will be up on Wednesday on the website, and you can register and go from there. So let's get back to the framework of non-doership. Someone asked me this week in one of the sessions I was giving about the role of the guru, or guru means teacher. And they brought up the fact that it's often said that without a guru, the process wouldn't, or enlightenment can't happen. And so they asked for my opinion on this concept. Is it true that you have to not only have a guru, but be in the physical presence of the guru? That's what is often put forward in the older teachings, that you have to be in the presence of the guru for things to progress. My answer was essentially that the role of the teacher, so there's a reason why that was said in the traditional scripts, because what it does is it encourages people to make the effort to go there, because it says you need to be in the presence of the guru. Now, back then there might have been some books, but books were harder to come by for the vast majority of people, and there wasn't any YouTube or voice recordings and whatever. So essentially the teachings were saying you have to be in the presence of the guru, because that was a way of getting you in front of a teacher, in front of a teaching. And what a teacher does is they put forward ideas, concepts, hints, tips, techniques that are all aimed at bringing about a change. Now, I know that often we're told that the change is not an intellectual change. And once again, there's a reason for that. But when we really look at it, whatever is being said by the teacher is being received by our senses, and it's being processed by the brain, and it is intellectual. So it might not be intellectual in the sense that we need to understand very complex formulas and be able to recite them and whatever. But just a notion that says, there is no teaching, there is no teacher, and there is no student. And it says there's no teaching to give. That in itself is a concept that is part of that teaching. So it's a teaching that says there is no teaching, and that concept is received by the seeker that is listening. Now, there is a reason that concept is put forward. The reason is that we are convinced that the only way things happen is through understanding knowledge, that through gaining facts, that we are so convinced that our happiness is to be found in outcomes, that in itself is, I will be happy when I get more than what I have now. And so in order to get more, we say, okay, tell me how to do it. Tell me what I need to know. So it's more acquiring. Now that is the standard movement of the intellect as it's set up as part of our development. So I wouldn't even say it's standard movement of the intellect, but standard movement of a deeply ingrained structure of which the intellect is part. And so it is continually looking out for more to gain more. And that is a movement that in this teaching is referred to as attachment to outcome. Attachment to outcome is the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness that we don't necessarily have, where we could say, I'm not sure that I'm really content in life, either because we feel very uncomfortable, or we might not feel very uncomfortable, but from time to time we look back and we go, look, I've been alive for 30 or 40, 50 years, and I don't feel like I've got where I need to be, and I'm running out of time, and I don't feel particularly content or satisfied with life, like a feeling of what's the point. And attachment to outcome is this assumption that life will change from the way it is, where we don't feel satisfied, when we get something, whether it's a partner, a soulmate, whether it's more money, whether it's bliss or joy or even enlightenment. So we can have these concepts that we say, and turn the concept of enlightenment or the concept of bliss or joy into the thing that we will have that will give us happiness. So it's a deeply ingrained presupposition that we don't even question. So straight away, if someone says, you will one day be happy, that we assume that's because we're going to get something. And that is, in essence, the problem. Right? That if we boil it down to one thing, suffering exists because of attachment to outcome. Now, once again, Buddha has said this. Let's see if I can get it right. He goes, enlightenment is the end of suffering. So he hasn't said enlightenment is the gaining of bliss or the gaining of something you don't have right now. He's expressed it in its negative form, which is the more accurate. If someone can understand it. Now, it's hard for us to understand negation, especially when we simply don't believe that we will gain anything by losing something. Phrasing it in its negative form might not be effective because a lot of people just simply won't be able to hear it. But if we are able to hear it, that is more accurate. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. And the cause of desire is attachment. That's the Buddha's summation. I'll say it again. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. The cause of desire is attachment. So, what does that mean in more layman's terms? Enlightenment, that's the holy grail that often we don't know what it is, but we know we want it because it's very rare and it's very great. So seekers are seeking enlightenment. So Buddha has said, okay, you're seeking enlightenment. I'll tell you it's the end of suffering. Okay, if it's the end of suffering, tell me what suffering is. Suffering is caused by desire. What is desire? Desire is, I want this. I crave this. Why do we crave this? That which is desire. And it says the cause of desire is attachment. So what is attachment? I said it 10 minutes ago, so you'll see I'm not making this up. Attachment is the deeply ingrained belief that I will be happy when I get something. And so this notion of attachment is the deeply ingrained presupposition that in order for me to be happy, I need to get something I don't have. And with that in place, we find things that we assume must be the things that we don't have, that we will one day maybe get, that will give us happiness or enlightenment. Forget about enlightenment, but because suffering exists prior to anyone even thinking about enlightenment. So we assume we need to get something we don't have, that is attachment. We set our sights on one or several things that we don't have, that becomes what we desire. And because we desire that wholeheartedly, means we are fully invested in that being the answer, we never look inwards. And when we don't look inwards, we only know ourselves in a conceptual form, meaning the sense of self that has formed as part of the natural formation of the human being. That includes this attachment. That is essentially the false self, not what we really are. And for as long as that entity, that psychological, conceptual entity exists, it covers up the true self, which is something that exists prior to thinking, prior to a concept of oneself. So, let's see if I can remember where I was. Oh yes, we were talking about the need for a teacher or guru and being in their presence. So essentially, so I was saying that the guru is only ever putting out teachings. And even a teaching that seems like it isn't talking to our intellect is actually talking to our intellect. And the example I was saying is a teaching that says, I don't have a teaching to give you. There is no teacher and there is no student. That in itself is information that is being given to the student that apparently doesn't exist by the teacher that also apparently doesn't exist, which is not a criticism because it's trying to make a point. And the point is that we are so convinced that we need something that the teaching needs to break that craving for information, for knowledge. And it will say there is you're not going to get any knowledge from me. So, but the irony is that in saying that, which is essentially trying to put the seeker on the right track, because it won't just say that, it will then go into elaborations about how we are continually wanting something, and that is one of the movements of the mind that causes us to not be able to look inward, right? And then after putting forward that explanation, someone might ask a question and the teacher will reaffirm, you're asking me for information. I have nothing to give you. Just be yourself prior to thinking. And so hopefully in me using this example, you can see how by being in front of the teacher, you're getting that information and elaborations on that. And then if a seeker steps off the path and asks a question, what about reincarnation, for example. And the teacher will then use that opportunity to say, you see, you want more information about reincarnation, about this, about that. Just be who you are. You're already that. Who cares about reincarnation? What you want is to know yourself now. Why wait another 1,000 lifetimes to know yourself? If you think it's all about that, you will be looking for enlightenment in another life, which is not where it's going to be found. You've turned it into something to seek. So being in the presence of the guru is essentially saying that when you're there, when you are in the presence of the guru, you are going to be getting what you need. Now, often we assume that it means if you're in the presence of the guru, you're going to be zapped by universal energy, or receive Shakti Pat, or receive a transmission of energy that is going to send your body into convulsions. And now, in the presence of some people, in the presence of some areas, there is stronger energetic fields, and they may have an effect on breaking down blocks in the body. But essentially, even if that is happening, it's happening because the information is being transmitted in a different way. Essentially, it is about one system that has a certain structure receiving new information that changes it. Now, the information doesn't have to be intellectual, or it doesn't have to be received verbally, but the majority of the change happens because we receive information. And a lot of the time, we're receiving that information through word of mouth, and we don't even realize that that is actually information that is being processed by our system, because it is information that says something like, don't think. So it seems like that is not information. But when you think about it, it is information that says thinking is the problem. Stop and just be. So why do we need to get this information from teachers or gurus? And the fact is that our system is so strongly shaped to see life a particular way that if we weren't given hints, if we weren't given the benefit of the road that other people have traveled, then the likelihood of change is that it would happen very, very slowly. If, however, we are lucky enough to get information from someone that has traversed the path, has done a whole lot of thinking, has benefited from their teacher who has done a whole lot of thinking, that benefited from their teacher that got pointers from before them. And so the whole thing gets condensed down into very potent pointers, very potent concepts that get passed on, not to just give you the information and that's it, but rather to inspire an investigation, a contemplation of your own, to get you to look behind corners that you don't even know are there. And once the corner is pointed out, you then have a chance to see around it. But for as long as it's not, your attention isn't directed there, and furthermore, not only directed there, but then suggested at what is important to look at there, we just wouldn't think in that way. So the simple notion of suggesting that one's happiness is not to be found in outcomes is something that can be very, very obvious for someone who has gone through that process, aided by their teacher and their teacher's teacher, who said, look, this is the pointer. Your happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. If that's not pointed out, it could take us more than this lifetime, by which time we're dead, and so it's too late. It could take us more than the lifetime to realize my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Even though we've had a whole lifetime of seeking outcomes, getting them, and not receiving an ongoing satisfaction, an ongoing contentment, our thinking is so convinced it's out there that if we won the lottery, and so financial circumstance wasn't a problem anymore, and yet happiness didn't exist, the intellect would say, oh, it must be because I don't have the right friends, or because I'm not good enough at certain skills, or certain social interactions. So the intellect will find another reason, another outcome that it doesn't have to explain its unhappiness, instead of at some point saying, I've acquired this pleasure and this pleasure, all of which are outcomes, and still I haven't found an ongoing satisfaction. Maybe my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. With the aid of a teaching, we tend to look at outcomes, we tend to look at our contentment, and the teaching has already told us 100,000 times, your happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And that's when it kicks in and goes, of course, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And we look around and we see all the teachings saying the same thing. And that's when we get the confidence to follow that and look into it in more detail. So do you really need to be in the presence of the guru? I don't think that you do. I think it's simply about getting information. So with the age that we're in now, there's information online. The important part is that information is being delivered. And not only that it's delivered, but that there is a capacity for it to be received the right way. And so these variables, the fact that it's delivered, and that the right information is delivered and that it's processed the right way, are variables that are not in our control. And that's why it's said that, but the outcome is not in our control, because we don't know how it's being received. And so, sometimes there is a question. Someone will send a message. Can you be my teacher? And I'm sure that question is asked out of having come across this concept and feeling like, I need to establish a formal, relationship with the guru. And my response is, as far as I see, it doesn't work like that. There's no formal application form where you need to be initiated and then said, yes, I am your guru, or you are the student, or anything like that. If there is an exchange of information and things are happening, that relationship is already set up. So sometimes we read these things and take them too literally. And so it's important, I think, to get a retake on what it's all, or what these statements mean. And if we can hear them differently, we might find the system opens up just a little bit, because that particular point has been heard differently. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that don't make an effort to be in the presence of the teacher, because, as they say, be in the company of sages, I think is one of Ramana's main rules. Because if you're there, you're going to get particular one-on-one information that is pertinent to a question that you might ask, which might be different to just listening to the satsangs or reading a book. So I know that when I was visiting Ramesh and quite clearly felt and saw him as my guru, I went to India 16 times in the space of 4 years. When I said this to someone this week in regard to the question, they said, "Oh, why did you only go 16 times?" I said, "Well, he died." I'm sure there would have been a 17th, 18th, and 25th time had he not died, even though suffering isn't the reason I would be going. And I think it's fair to say that I kept going for many years after the suffering came to an end. There's just an appreciation and a love and a beauty of being able to be in that space when it's possible. So if the feeling arises and you can go and be with someone that you resonate with, then by all means, it's not to say you shouldn't go. But the most important thing is that the information is being delivered. Two questions that came up, funnily enough, in the same week. So I will address them because it might be something that it probably is something other people are thinking about. And that is, why is pleasure and pain, which is said in the teaching to be the characteristic of the flow of life? So circumstance is always, only ever, either pleasure or pain, or something in between, neutral. But if you looked at it on the spectrum of pleasure on one side and pain on the other, the zero mark is an almost non-existent mark on the spectrum. So it could be very mild pleasure, very mild pain, extreme pain or extreme pleasure, anything on that spectrum. In practice, we could say something is neutral, like, you might be outside and you go, well, this isn't pleasure or pain, it's just the weather, for example. You go, it's just neutral. If you compared it to pain, you might really say, wow, this is actually pleasure. But anyhow, so that's not such an important point. The question was, why is the flow of life, which is either pleasure or pain, broken into three different categories: physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, and financial pleasure and pain? So the question is, why does financial pleasure and pain make it into the mix? If we add financial pleasure and pain, shouldn't we add in a whole lot of other categories like, I don't know, well, a whole lot of other categories. The reason I'm struggling is because there are a whole lot of other categories under what is termed financial pleasure and pain. And it essentially, one of the people that asked the question answered the question in the question. They said, maybe it just refers to all material pleasure and pain. And that is a good summation of it. So if you find the ticket price of an airplane fare goes up, we can call that financial pain, because it means you're going to have to pay more finances for that. If someone bangs into your car and you don't know who it is and it's going to cost you $1,000, that is financial pain, because it's going to mean less money in your bank account. If someone breaks something in the house, a table, you could say that's financial pain in the moment, because eventually you're going to have to replace the table, or you're not going to have the table. So it could be an inconvenience pain. Now, the other categories are physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. So physical pleasure and pain is quite straightforward. If the shower is too cold, you could say that is pain in the moment. If you have a backache, that's pain in the moment. If you have some great food, you can say that's physical pleasure in the moment. If someone's giving you a massage and it's nice, it's physical pleasure in the moment. If you stub your toe, it's physical pain in the moment. If your table is broken or your chair is broken, that might be physical pain in the moment at some point. It may also mean financial pain, because you might need to buy a new table or chair in order for there not to be physical pain in the moment, or in order for your daily life to unfold as it needs to unfold on a practical level. Emotional pleasure and pain, and I think one of the reasons that one might question why do we have a category for physical pleasure and pain is because there isn't necessarily a clarity about what emotional pleasure and pain is. And I think that a lot of times when people hear emotional pleasure and pain, they think about psychological suffering, or what is referred to in the teaching as a separate topic of suffering. So suffering is not what is referred to as emotional pain. Now, because we all have our own vocabulary, if someone is suffering, feeling, let's say, unworthy, or feeling like life is just too hard and feeling depressed, or having lost someone they love and then feeling very uncomfortable on the level of self, which is the suffering, that might be referred to as, oh, I'm in so much pain. So the suffering could easily be referred to as psychological pain or just pain. And if we do find ourselves referring to our suffering as pain, then it makes sense that we're going to, when we hear the word emotional pain, when we hear the terminology emotional pain, we're going to assume that means suffering. And because we suffer in relation to, let's say, financial pain, when financial pain happens, which is just the event, automatically our attitude kicks in, and we might start blaming, feeling regret, feeling hard done by. And so we'll say, well, what do I need to categorize it as financial pain? Because that is emotional pain. So I can stick that under emotional pain. We go, it's not physical pain, because what did I say happened? Let's say the car broke down and it's going to cost you money, and you're not going to be able to pay for your holiday anymore because you need to buy a new engine for your car or whatever. And then we go into the suffering. We say, this is emotional pain. And I say, no, let's get it straight, because we're mixing things up. We're mixing up the flow of life and the attitude to the flow of life. And they're very easy to mix up, because the way that we tend to see life is we don't clearly see the flow of life and our attitude to the flow of life until it is pointed out that those two things exist. And so this distinction of the various types of pleasure and pain, and a separate distinction about peace and suffering, is in the framework to help give our intellect a reference that they are different things. So before we look at them, what happens is attachment to outcome means that as soon as the outcome happens, there is a registering of the outcome, a judging of it as if it's what we want or what we don't want, and if it's not in line with our expectations, automatically the suffering arises. And so the one event gets experienced in an instant such that it includes all of the variables, all of the components, and it's not discernibly obvious that there are several components involved, because the suffering is an attitude towards the outcome, right? So what it's saying is, he hurt me, so I hate him for what he did. Now the uncomfortableness is arising, and that's the hatred, right? But the hatred is saying, he hurt me, and then we are feeling hatred towards him because he hurt me. And so it seems like that hatred is because he hurt me, right? So it's a tricky thing, because it's an attitude towards outcome. We don't get to see that there are two layers. It is just assumed that I am feeling the way I feel because of the action of the other. And unless this is seen, we are doomed to continue to relate to life that way, because that is part of the not seeing the layers clearly. And so this is why this topic is so important. This is why I think it's worth addressing the question. And it's why in the teaching, the flow of life, meaning circumstance, is described as either pleasure or pain. And then furthermore, we go into examples and say you can have physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. And your peace or your suffering is always existent on a different layer to the flow of life, a different layer to the pleasure and pain, and it is what we can call your attitude to the pleasure or pain. So what this is hopefully starting to do is it starts to tell us, oh, I'm not feeling unhappy and uncomfortable with myself and with the other because of what the other did, but rather because of my attitude towards what the other did, or my attitude towards what I did. And what is it? What attitude is it that creates the uncomfortableness, creates the suffering? What attitude towards the circumstance is it that creates the suffering? It's the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcome. So remember, Buddha has said, events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. That means if we have an attitude of doership, an attitude of personal independent doer, we are essentially not seeing life as described by the Buddha, no personal doer thereof. And instead we are introducing an attitude towards the circumstance that says he is the doer, and as the doer, he should have and could have done it differently. And so I hate him for him having chosen of his own free will and volition, his own autonomy, to do life the way he did it, that delivered pain to me. And the second part of the attitude is the attachment to outcome. The attachment to outcome is, remember, also according to Buddha, enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire, and the cause of desire is attachment, right? And liberation or enlightenment is essentially the end of attachment, because enlightenment is said to be the end of suffering. Suffering is caused by desire, desire is caused by attachment. How can attachment to outcomes end, i.e. enlightenment happen? It can end because it isn't how things are really are. And so if things are seen clearly, that attitude towards circumstance will change. So it's the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to what happens in the flow of life that determines whether internally there is suffering or not. This is one of the most fundamental clarities that needs to come about for us to start seeing the flow of life and then our attitude to the flow of life. So remember the 3 different categories. You could make up 100 different categories of pleasure and pain. It just means that you'll be creating drop-down menus under each of the physical, emotional, and financial broader headings. So I think it's much better to have the broad headings, and then for you to start being able to categorize the stubbing of your toe under physical pain, categorizing the great meal under physical pleasure, the watching of the listening to great music as physical pleasure, and a lot of circumstances include several of the components. So you might have physical pain if you break your arm, and that might also be financial pain if you have to pay for the surgeon to fix it. You might listen to great music, and it can be physical pleasure, but it can even go deeper where it is some sort of emotional pleasure. Or it could be physical pleasure and also create some emotional pain, because it might trigger some memories of times you spent with someone that you loved who has died, for example. So this middle category of emotional pain is the one that we need to become clear on, because often when we look at emotional pain, we are mistaking and putting suffering into that category of emotional pain. So let's not put suffering into the emotional pain category. So where it becomes tricky is for us to see emotional pain separate from suffering, because they don't exist on the physical realm. They both exist on the internal realm, both emotional pain and suffering. And because of attachment to outcome, whenever there is emotional pain, if attachment to outcome is there, the suffering will arise simultaneously. So if we understand this in principle, that this is what's happening, that's how we might start to be able to tease the two apart. So an example of this is, let's say you help someone move house. They ask you if you can spare a day, and so you say yes. And let's say you were distracted on the day, and you maybe had to spend time on the phone. You were tired. You didn't really want to be there. And sometime later, your friend says, "Listen, I have to tell you, I was really disappointed with you. You didn't show up for me." I think it's a sign of our friendship. Now, you might be sad that your friend has taken it that way. Maybe they completely misunderstand. Take some other scenario. They think you did something behind their back, and in fact that wasn't the case. Whether it was the case or wasn't the case is not so important, because it's easier to see if it wasn't the case. Let's say they think it was, and they don't want to be your friend anymore. So it's not your preference. Let's say you valued the friendship. It's not your preference. It's sad. I have some situations where people have actually misinterpreted a situation and come to certain conclusions that are the very opposite of what my relationship or my intention, or in fact the very action wasn't what has been concluded, and a friendship came to an end because of this. And it was a dear friend, and so it is sad to me that this is how things transpired. The suffering doesn't happen. Sadness can come up. I can go, it is sad that this is how it turned out. He was a great friend. So the sadness is because it's on the emotional level. It's not physical, it's not financial, it's on the emotional level. And it's not as I would prefer. But as long as there isn't attachment to the outcome, which means I know that even with things turning out that way, who I am is independent of that, is separate from that. So let's say in that situation, what the person thinks happened actually did happen, and then doesn't want to be our friend. Still, we could say, that's really sad, and we can say, and I understand why they don't want to be my friend, because I did something that wasn't great. And so there can be sadness about the fact that the friendship has ended. And yet in both cases, whether you did or you didn't do what they think you did, you can be free of suffering, because you can know, even with that being the way life turned out, I'm complete. Now, that's not just it's not meant to be just a concept. It has to be something that you feel, meaning that you feel complete even with that having happened, which doesn't mean that you don't see it as a sad thing. You don't go, oh, I'm complete, so who cares about you? F off. Right? It's not that at all. It's like, that is sad, and yet I know that I am. That there is a part of myself that I am in contact with that hasn't changed, because the friendship has changed. And so we can say the same with a partner that might get sick and die. That is sad. On the circumstantial level, you may have shared a whole lifetime together, and now that person is not there anymore, and so there are going to be times when you might feel lonely, and you might think about times when you did things together, and you can feel sadness. Now that sadness, when you go into it, if it's the pure sadness, is often based on love, right? It's sad that a friend doesn't want to be your friend. Why is it sad? Because you love them. And why is it sad that a partner has died and you feel lonely from time to time? It's because you love them. Now, at the bottom of the love, there probably is appreciation and not bitterness. That means in the pure sadness, there is sadness, but a gratitude for the fact that that was there. Instead of what we can have, which then turns into suffering, is a bitterness for what has been lost, in a sense. So if it's biological sadness, if we look deeply, we'll find that it's actually, at its root, there's love. But it's very easy for that sadness, for the attachment to outcome to come in and feel guilt, blame, or expectation. Expectation is, oh, I expected them to interpret the situation differently. Oh, I expected them to live longer than they lived. I expected my life to include them in my life for longer than they were there. And if that is the case, then we feel like our conceptual sense of self is not complete anymore, because our conceptual sense of self is essentially made up of these attachments and expectations. And so when they're not delivered, we feel attacked on the level of self, which is really not the true self, but the psychological self. So the teachings, any teachings, are essentially a bunch of concepts and not the truth. So there are always going to be imperfections. However, I'm particularly fond and impressed by the robustness of this particular framework. And I know that at times, it was the case for me, at times we go off on parts of the journey that sort of open up side doors, as I would call them, and it feels like it's about something else. It's about energetic movements. It's about insights. It's about states. It's about maybe seeing life as a dream, not real, no person. And all of these movements are very valid. They are the journey. What I think we'll find is that when we go into those side doors and we sometimes feel like, oh, this is what it's about, and this is what has been not being spoken about. And we go in there and we say, okay, now I'm on track. And inevitably that stepping into that room has a limited time scale, because it's a part of the process. So we tend to find ourselves stepping out of that room at some point. And it's when we step out of that room, we realize actually it's about peace of mind. We'll find that the concepts hold up. And so if you find yourself needing to move away from the concepts because you step into a room where they don't seem particularly relevant, I think that's perfect. That is how the journey unfolds. What I think everyone will find out for themselves is that we keep coming back and going, wow, it does always come back to peace of mind in daily living. We'll find that because you might go into a room where it's about authentic relating or tantra, different exercises of communication and sexuality that maybe you hadn't explored. And in that, you find a community that is very exciting, and you find yourself doing activities that are enriching and allow you to feel and see things that you hadn't seen before. And so that's fantastic. That's what the journey is. We all get what we need at the right time. But in those rooms, eventually we find that the suffering dynamics reform in their own way, in the new relationships that one has, in the new craving for orgasms that last longer, or meditations that take us deeper into various places. And the suffering finds its way in, and eventually we see that, oh, this wasn't the full answer that it might have appeared when we stepped into the room. And that's when we sort of find ourselves integrating that experience back into the teachings of non-doership and peace of mind and daily living. So talking of the framework, that's what I was going to get onto, is really these concepts. Hopefully, once, like many of you do, you find yourself listening to the teachings on a regular basis, sometimes daily, sometimes the feedback I get is people are listening to more than one talk a day. And I can completely relate to that. When we find something that feeds us, something that has the information that we need, we can keep going back to it and listen over and over again. And I suggest listening to one satsang. I'll say this again because it also tends not to be how we look at things when we are looking to gain stuff. We sort of think, oh, I've read that book, so I can't read it again, or I've seen that movie, so I won't watch it again. I'm a big fan of listening to something 10 times or 20 times, because you really start to hear what is being said. So I know many of you have listened to hundreds of satsangs, and you'll know that some of the key concepts are: my happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. That is a concept, a pointer, a reminder that might start coming up because it becomes part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, that reminds you my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. Life is a happening according to God's will, not my will or their will, but part of a much bigger picture, a much bigger creation, a much bigger orchestration. Now, both of those concepts, which can become like your own mantras, they can start arising, are essentially pointing to attachment and doership. And so it's so important that the concept starts becoming, this is where the notion of the Satguru, right? So we start off needing a teacher and a teaching, and eventually that information has given us enough clarity about how life works in principle, let's say, and what the important points for us to look at are, that we have our own internal tools to deal with the suffering when it's there, to look into it, to know where to start looking, because we might have, for example, the notion that all suffering is based on doership and attachment to outcomes. And if we understand what doership means and what attachment to outcomes is, we can see when we feel uncomfortable, we can at least ask, what is it that this is really about? What's going on? And that's when our own inner system is equipped enough to start unpicking things itself. And when it unpicks a scenario, let's say an event between friends, and there's an uncomfortableness, and we say, look, okay, I'm feeling uncomfortable. I don't know what it's about, but I know that all uncomfortableness is doership and attachment to outcome. So we use that as the starting point, and we say, let me look at the situation, and we say, look, I can see that I'm blaming my friend for not valuing the friendship, for example. We think he's done something or she's done something that doesn't value the friendship. And then we say, I think he should have done this, and because he has done, that's it. I can't imagine. I'm not going to talk to him. I hate him. I want to get revenge. I want him to hurt. So I'm going to ignore him. I'm going to, if he asks, get angry with him and explain why I'm upset. And so if we see this, we say, look, okay, so there's doership. He should have acted differently. And attachment to outcome. I wanted him to act in a way that delivers pleasure to me. Instead, he acted in a way that delivers pain. And not only I wanted it because it's preferable according to my biological preferences, but I obviously wanted it in a way where I was attached to that being the only viable possibility that keeps my idea of myself intact. And because he has delivered pain, now my sense of self is attacked by that, because we believe in our psychological sense of self that pain is a diminisher of who we are. And so our own understanding of the framework can hopefully allow us to unpick these things when they're happening. And the more that they get unpicked, the more the framework gets sort of ticks next to it, and we say, yes, that's how it actually works. I've seen it. And we tend to see parts of the dynamic, parts of the doership and attachment that might not have been explained in the framework, or we might not have heard, and we see something for ourselves, or we see something that was explained and we see it in the dynamic as we're investigating it. And that further strengthens our own wisdom, right? The Satguru, which then means that as that strengthens, we get to see more and more details, which contributes to more and more of our understanding of how things are working, which means we can deal with the remaining blocks more and more efficiently. So it becomes a snowballing effect. And that's when we realize, oh, I don't need an external guru. I have my own wisdom inside. But that wisdom really needs to be activated. It needs to be cultivated. And it gets cultivated through, at first, the information coming in from the external guru, and then we start feeling that we're being guided by an internal wisdom. So that's also a significant part of this question about teachings and teachers, and why I think the framework is so important, because it puts things in everyday language, then the framework becomes something that we can hopefully find that gets applied to daily life more and more regularly, in such a way that our structures, our habits of doership and attachment start to break down. So before I opened up for questions, I thought I'd use an example of how we can catch out these dynamics of involvement. And one example, well, I mentioned the example of a friend that misinterpreted something, and we're no longer as friendly as we used to be quite some time ago. And the attitude has to be, I can understand why the situation was misinterpreted. It makes sense that that happened. So the blame towards him isn't there. I can see why that conclusion was formed. So if we can understand that someone is just functioning according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and we can understand why, from their point of view, something might have looked a certain way, then that is part of us being able to let it be, to not resist either side of the fence, to say this is how it is and it makes sense to me. So another example was when I was working in a corporate situation and I got an offer to move to another firm, and I decided it was worthwhile, and the company I was working for imposed a rule which was pretty standard for the employees, which was you give 4 weeks notice, and in those 4 weeks you essentially stay at home. You don't come into work, and you're still working for us, so you can't go and work for anyone else. It was called gardening leave. And it just so happened that my contract didn't mention anything about this in it, and I always had an issue with the company taking advantage of certain things. And so when it came time, I gave my notice saying I'll either work out my 4 weeks continuing to deal with my client base, or I'll give my notice effective as of today, if you would prefer that. And they didn't really like that. And so a legal situation eventuated where, legal things are never good. You're essentially in a battle, and depends what your attitude is. And at some point there was a mediation, and between myself and the boss, the general manager or the CEO, and the event eventually was settled, and so that was that. But there was tension in a way where two people were at disagreement. Now, it depends on the attitude. If we go in and we say, it makes complete sense, they have their policies, and I had what I wanted, and there was no legal obligation according to my contract, and yet they wanted to impose it. And so there was this sort of difference of opinion. So we go, okay, that's life. We're going to have difference of opinion, and we have to go down a path of finding the solution, whichever path that happens to be. And so obviously that's never that pleasant, you could say. The question is, do you hate the person for being part of a situation that is not pleasant? So afterwards, there was a time I was out walking and I bumped into the managing director, and we found ourselves talking, not referencing what had happened. It was like pleasant, fine. And after a few minutes, we went off, walked in opposite directions, and that was it. And it occurred to me, I don't hate him. Whereas it would be so easy to make that pain, that situation, say, you did that to me, and I hate you for that. And so if we can understand that the flow of life is going to include pleasure and pain, and if we find ourselves not focusing on life needing to be pleasure, 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 then the whole attitude to life changes. So I got another, so this was going to be one of the other examples. I got a comment this week, I think it was on YouTube somewhere, one of the old videos. And someone said, what do you think about the lockdowns in Australia now? At the beginning of the pandemic, you said that it was all conspiracy theory. And I sort of read the post thinking, well, because there are lockdowns, doesn't change my view on. They were implying that anyone who was against, vaccines, I was saying that, you're a conspiracy theorist, or there's no validity in taking that view. So now they're saying, what do you think about it now that you have lockdowns? And when I was reading it, I was thinking, you see, this is great because it shows how our attitude is usually focused on the flow of life needs to be good, needs to be pleasurable. And if it's not good or pleasurable, who do we blame? Right? We need to blame someone for it not being according to my expectations. So to further elaborate, let's say that there are restrictions put in place and they are not favorable to you. It means your business isn't as viable as it used to be, so there can be financial pain. You're not able to move about as you used to, so there could be inconvenience and whatever. If we can understand that life is going to be variable, then the attitude, instead of it says, who made it variable? Why is it not working the way life is meant to work? Instead of that being the attitude, then the attitude is, oh yes, life is painful. Now, if there's something we can do about it, by all means, but that what we do about it hopefully doesn't turn the other into an enemy. So if we turn the other into a competitor, into a rival, or into an enemy, that is where we are seeing the other as the doer that has caused the pain that is an attack on my happiness. And what it also means is that if something for the whole delivers pain to me, we automatically assume that it's not good. Now, it's true, it isn't good for you because it's delivering pain, but it might be delivering a better outcome than would be otherwise. Maybe even for you, but even if not for you, maybe for the group on the whole, which means it's a good decision. I'm not saying that governments are making good decisions, because I don't think governments necessarily know definitively what is going to work and what's not going to work. I'm not saying that they're not influenced by certain motivations that will mean decisions of a certain sort will be made. And the whole thing is, that's, as far as I see it, that's not the point. Because if we are looking at groups, and so my point isn't even here saying agree with me, because the person that sent in the question, or not the question, but the comment, is not someone I hate at all. It makes complete sense to me that they're relating to the situation in such a way that they are resisting it because it is delivering pain to them. So that makes complete sense. What my point here is in pointing out, if we can understand that life is set up in the way it is, which even if it included governments that were all corrupt, even if that was the case, on some level we have to look at it and say, well, that's life. That's life. And if we resist that with the attitude of seeing the other as a competitor, a rival, and an enemy, then we're going to live with hatred and live in resistance. If we address the situation without seeing the other as a competitor, a rival, or an enemy, we can address the situation as best we can, understand the outcome is not in our control, and once the outcome has eventuated, which might mean we end up with even more pain than before we started addressing the situation, if we can see, and that too is life unfolding, and even if the pain is being delivered by the actions of another towards me, we see that they are just an instrument through which life is functioning, and it's my destiny for life to turn out this way, then our attitude becomes so much less personal, where we understand, yes, my destiny is a mix of pleasure and pain, and in this moment there is pain in the moment, and the other is the instrument through which that pain is being delivered, all of which is a happening according to God's will, my life unfolding. Now, that's not an attitude that we can make happen. It's an attitude that comes about as a whole lot of things in our system shift and change. And at some point we might look back and see, over the last year, over the last 6 months, I haven't been relating to the other as the doer. I haven't been relating to outcomes as what is most important. And we might even realize, and that's just been happening naturally because something has changed. Life puts in place the misunderstanding as part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And change happens because life delivers new conditioning that changes our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And then we find ourselves functioning automatically, like we always have, according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Previously, the conditioning included the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. And over the course of a period of time, that deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome got eroded. And then we find it's not there anymore. And so the attitude and the suffering stops arising. That, I suggest, is what liberation is. The end of suffering. So let's take some questions. Hello,
Hello,
Holger.
Roger.
Hello, Holger.
Only 9 minutes left, and I just wanted to say thank you for your satsang and for your pointers and for your clarity. And
You're welcome. My pleasure.
yeah, that's the only thing on my mind right now.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know what it's like. It's a pleasure.